Marcus Chen adjusted his helmet's air recycler for the third time that morning, the familiar hiss of the oxygen scrubbers mixing with the ambient hum of the mining station. The asteroid belt surrounding Kepler, 442b, had become his second home over the past 18 months. A collection of floating rocks that the Galactic Mining Consortium insisted held untold riches. So far, Marcus had found mostly disappointment and a persistent ache in his lower back. The human surveyor floated through the cramped corridors of Station Omega 7, his magnetic boots clicking against the metal flooring in a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Around him, the usual mix of species went about their daily routines. A pair of Zenthari engineers chittered in their clicking language as they calibrated gravity generators, their insectoid limbs moving with mechanical precision. 3 Vorthak merchants haggled over shipping manifests near the trade bay, their tentacles writhing in what Marcus had learned indicated either extreme pleasure or murderous rage. Another glorious day in paradise, Marcus muttered to himself, checking his tablet for the morning's assignments. The screen flickered with the usual list of survey coordinates, each one representing another chunk of space rock that probably contained nothing more valuable than iron oxide and his growing sense of existential dread. The mining station existed in the shadow of something far more impressive than any asteroid. Through the reinforced viewing ports, Marcus could see the edge of what the locals called the Dragon's Graveyard, a massive nebula that stretched across several light-years. The swirling clouds of gas and cosmic dust glowed with an ethereal beauty that never failed to capture his attention, even after all these months. Ancient legends claimed it was where the great dragon emperors of the Draconis Imperium came to die, though Marcus had always assumed that was just another piece of alien folklore designed to keep curious miners from venturing too deep into potentially profitable territory. The Draconis Imperium itself was more legend than reality these days. Once, according to the history databases, they had ruled a third of the known galaxy, with wisdom and terrible power. Their dragon emperors were said to be immortal beings of incredible intelligence and cosmic awareness, capable of traversing the void between stars without technological assistance. But that was thousands of years ago, before the Great Silence, before their empire mysteriously collapsed overnight. Now the occasional Draconi scout ship would appear at the edge of inhabited space, conduct some incomprehensible business, and vanish again without meaningful contact. Marcus had seen exactly one Draconis in his entire life, and that had been from a distance of several thousand kilometers while transiting through the Rigel system. Even from that range, the being's ship had been magnificent, a flowing work of art that seemed to bend space around itself. The creature inside had been barely visible, but Marcus remembered scales that caught starlight like prisms, and eyes that seemed to hold the depth of cosmic time itself. "Chen, you're up for deep sector survey today," called Station Commander Yelith, her Andromedan vocal cords producing the grinding harmonics that passed for her species' version of cheerfulness. Sector 77 Alpha needs a full mineral analysis. Marcus glanced at his tablet again, noting that Sector 77 Alpha was dangerously close to the nebula's edge. "That's pretty close to the restricted zone, Commander." "Restricted by whom?" Yeleth's forearms gestured dismissively. "The consortium holds legal salvage rights to everything within 50,000 kilometers of this station. If the Dragons wanted to keep us out, they should have filed the proper territorial claims through the Galactic Trade Authority." The logic was typically corporate and typically short-sighted. The Galactic Trade Authority barely had jurisdiction over civilized space, let alone the wild reaches where ancient empires might still hold sway. But Marcus needed this job, and arguing with Yelith was like trying to negotiate with a particularly stubborn asteroid. "Understood, Commander. I'll prep the survey pod." The survey pod was a cramped affair, barely large enough for Marcus and his equipment. It had been designed by the lowest bidder for the Galactic Mining Consortium, which meant it featured all the luxury and safety margins of a recycled cargo container. The navigation system was older than Marcus himself. The life support had a tendency to make ominous clicking sounds at regular intervals, and the faster-than-light communication array worked only when the cosmic background radiation was feeling cooperative. Marcus ran through his pre-flight checklist with the thoroughness of someone who had no desire to become a frozen corpse drifting through space. Oxygen levels, check. Navigation systems mostly functional. Emergency beacon blinking reassuringly. Coffee supply, critically low but adequate for a 6-hour survey mission. The pod detached from Station Omega 7 with a gentle bump that suggested the docking clamps needed maintenance again. Marcus made a mental note to mention it to the engineering crew, assuming he survived the day's assignment. The main engines fired with their characteristic whine, pushing him away from the station's bulk and toward the coordinates Yale had specified. Space in the asteroid belt was not actually empty, despite what the entertainment network suggested. The region buzzed with activity as automated mining drones carved chunks from promising rocks, their cutting lasers creating brief, brilliant flashes in the darkness. Cargo haulers moved between the larger asteroids like enormous metal whales, their holds already heavy with extracted ore. Marcus had to adjust his course twice to avoid a convoy of Vorthak freighters whose pilots seemed to regard smaller craft as minor inconveniences rather than legitimate traffic. As he traveled deeper into the belt, the familiar bustle of commercial mining gave way to something more ominous. The asteroids here were darker, older, their surfaces scarred by impacts that predated most galactic civilizations. The automated beacons that marked safe navigation routes became sparser, their signals occasionally interrupted by strange electromagnetic phenomena that made his instruments flicker and dance. Survey Pod 7 to Station Omega 7 beginning approach to target coordinates. Marcus transmitted, though he wasn't entirely confident the message would reach the station through the increasing interference. The response came back distorted but recognizable. Copy. Survey Pod 7. Maintain standard protocols and report any unusual findings. Unusual findings. Marcus almost laughed. In 18 months of asteroid surveys, the most unusual thing he had discovered was a chunk of rock that contained trace amounts of platinum. Everything else had been variations on iron, nickel, and his own mounting student debt from xenogeology school. Sector 77 Alpha materialized on his forward sensors as a collection of medium-sized asteroids arranged in a rough cluster. The rocks were unremarkable in themselves, dark and irregular in the way that suggested they had been wandering through space for millions of years. But as Marcus drew closer, his instruments began detecting something that made him frown at his displays. There was a massive electromagnetic signature emanating from the center of the asteroid cluster, far too powerful and complex to be natural. The readings suggested some kind of advanced technology, but the patterns were unlike anything in his database of known civilizations. The energy output was enormous, yet it seemed to be slowly diminishing, as if whatever was generating it was gradually failing. "Well, that's definitely unusual," Marcus murmured, adjusting his sensors for a deeper scan. The detailed analysis made him sit back in his pilot's chair with a sharp intake of breath. The energy signature wasn't coming from any of the asteroids. It was coming from something hidden behind them, something large enough to dwarf his survey pod and powerful enough to bend local space-time in ways that made his navigation computer emit worried beeping sounds. Marcus faced a decision that would define the rest of his life, though he couldn't have known it at the time. Protocol demanded that he report the anomaly immediately and await instructions from the consortium. Common sense suggested that approaching unknown alien technology without backup was the kind of mistake that typically ended with memorial services and strongly worded corporate memos about safety procedures. But Marcus had always been curious, and 18 months of surveying empty rocks had left him hungry for something, anything that might prove his life had some purpose beyond generating quarterly reports for distant shareholders. He adjusted his course toward the energy signature. The asteroids fell away behind him as he maneuvered through the cluster, their familiar bulk replaced by something that made his breath catch in his throat. Floating in the space between the rocks was a ship, but calling it a ship was like calling a cathedral a building. The vessel stretched for kilometers, its hull flowing in organic curves that seemed to shift and change as he watched. The metal, if it was metal, caught and refracted light in ways that created patterns of color across its surface, as if the entire craft had been carved from a single massive gem. This was unmistakably Draconis work. Marcus had seen enough historical images to recognize their distinctive architectural style, the way they built their technology to mirror the flowing forms found in nature. But this ship was ancient, even by Draconis standards. Parts of its hull had gone dark, and massive sections showed damage from what might have been weapons fire or the simple erosion of cosmic time. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered, then immediately felt embarrassed for his lack of eloquence in the face of such magnificence. His instruments were going crazy, detecting energy signatures that fluctuated wildly across the electromagnetic spectrum. The ship was clearly damaged, possibly dying, but it was still active. Something inside that vast hull was still functioning, still drawing power from sources that human science could barely comprehend. Marcus activated his communication array and tried broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies. Unknown vessel, this is Survey Pod 7 of the Galactic Mining Consortium. Please respond if you require assistance. The response came not through his communication system, but directly into his mind, a voice that seemed to resonate with the weight of countless centuries. Small? One of the young species. Why do you venture into the realm of endings? Marcus gripped his control panel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Telepathic communication was not unknown among the various galactic species, but experiencing it for the first time was like having someone pour ice water directly into his brain. I'm conducting a survey mission. He managed to think back, hoping the entity could understand his crude mental transmission. I detected your energy signature and came to investigate. Are you in distress? A sound that might have been laughter echoed through his consciousness, though it carried an undertone of infinite sadness. Distress. Yes, small one. You could say that I am in distress. I am dying, and with me dies the last of what we once were. The implications of this statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. If this being was telling the truth, he was in the presence of the last Dragon Emperor, the final remnant of an empire that had once spanned the stars. The historical significance alone was staggering. But more than that, Marcus found himself genuinely moved by the profound loneliness in that ancient voice. Is there anything I can do to help? He asked, feeling foolish even as he formed the thought. What could a human mining surveyor possibly do for a being whose civilization predated most of galactic history? Help! The word seemed to surprise the entity. It has been 300 of your years since anyone offered help to Drakmor the Last. Most who venture here seek only to scavenge from my bones. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the thought of scavengers picking over the remains of this magnificent being. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because I was assigned to survey this sector, but now I just want to understand. Understand. Again, that note of surprise. You are curious about things beyond your immediate survival. How unusual for one of the young species. Tell me, small one, what is your designation? Marcus Chen. I'm a xenogeologist from Earth, assigned to asteroid mining operations in this sector. Earth. The name seemed to resonate with recognition. Yes, we observed your species during your early stellar expansion. Violent, crude, short-lived, but with an admirable tenacity. You have changed much in the brief time since we last paid attention. Marcus found himself oddly proud that his species had impressed the dragons, even if the assessment wasn't entirely flattering. We try to learn and grow. It's what humans do. Indeed. And what have you learned in your brief existence, Marcus Chen of Earth? The question caught Marcus off guard. He was used to discussing mineral compositions and ore extraction techniques, not philosophy with ancient cosmic beings. But something about Drakmor's presence encouraged honesty, as if the Dragon Emperor could see through any attempt at deception or pretense. I've learned that the universe is vast and full of wonders, but also that most of the time we're too busy with our own small concerns to appreciate them. I've learned that every species has something to teach the others, if we're willing to listen. And I've learned that sometimes the most important moments in your life happen when you're just trying to get through another routine day. Wisdom beyond your years, young Marcus Chen, and wisdom that my own people forgot in their final centuries. We became so focused on our own superiority, our own ancient knowledge, that we stopped listening to the younger voices in the galaxy. Perhaps if we had maintained your curiosity, your willingness to see wonder in the universe, we might not have retreated so far into ourselves that we forgot how to truly live. Marcus felt the weight of millennia in those words, the regret of an entire civilization compressed into a single thought. It's not too late, he said impulsively. You're still here. You can still share what you've learned, Help guide the younger species. I am dying, Marcus Chen. My life force ebbs with each passing moment, and when it is gone, the last connection to our great libraries, our accumulated knowledge, dies with me. The young species will have to find their own path among the stars, as perhaps they should. The resignation in Drakmore's mental voice sparked something rebellious in Marcus. He had spent most of his life accepting that important things were beyond his control, that individuals couldn't make a difference in the vast machinery of galactic civilization. But here, now, faced with the impending loss of countless millennia of knowledge and wisdom, that acceptance crumbled. What if there was a way? Marcus asked. What if someone could help preserve what you've learned, carry it forward to the younger species? The knowledge of the Dragon Emperors cannot be transferred to minds not born to contain it. We tried in our final years to create artificial repositories, but the essential understanding, the connections that give meaning to mere information, these require a consciousness capable of processing cosmic-scale concepts. Marcus stared at the magnificent ship floating before him, its ancient hull still beautiful despite the obvious damage and decay. An idea was forming in his mind. Crazy and probably impossible, but he had learned to trust his instincts during his months in the asteroid belt. What if you didn't transfer the knowledge to someone else? He asked slowly. What if you merged with a consciousness that could grow to accommodate it? The silence that followed stretched for what seemed like hours, though Marcus's chronometer indicated only a few minutes had passed. When Drakmore finally responded, his mental voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. You speak of the deep joining, a technique known to our ancestors but forbidden for millennia. The risks are enormous, young Marcus Chen. Even if it were possible, the process would fundamentally change both participants. You would no longer be entirely human, and I would no longer be entirely Draconis. We would become something new, something untested. But your knowledge would survive, Marcus pointed out, and maybe together we could find ways to share it that neither of us could manage alone. The process could kill you instantly, or worse, it could trap your consciousness in a state between life and death, aware but unable to act or escape. Even if you survived the initial merging, there is no way to know how a human mind would adapt to contain the memories and experiences of a Dragon Emperor. You could go mad, or lose yourself entirely in the vastness of what you would inherit. Marcus considered this, weighing the risks against the potential loss if Drakor died and took his civilization's knowledge with him. It wasn't really a choice at all. The universe was too precious, too full of wonders to let such knowledge vanish into the darkness. I understand the risks, he said finally. But I also understand what we lose if we don't try. You said my species has an admirable tenacity. Let me prove it. Another long silence, and when Drakmore spoke again, his mental voice carried an emotion that Marcus couldn't quite identify. In all my centuries, I have never encountered such courage in one so young. Very well, Marcus Chen of Earth. If you are truly willing, we shall attempt the deep joining. But know this, regardless of the outcome, you have already honored both our species by your willingness to risk everything for knowledge that is not even your own. The Dragon Emperor's ship began to move, its massive bulk shifting with surprising grace as docking ports opened along its hull. Bring your vessel aboard, brave human. If we are to attempt the impossible, we should do so properly. Marcus piloted his survey pod through the opening docking bay, his hands steady on the controls, despite the magnitude of what he was experiencing. The interior of Drakmore's ship defied every preconception he'd had about spacecraft design. Instead of sterile corridors and functional spaces, the vessel's interior resembled a living organism more than a machine. The walls curved in organic sweeps, their surfaces covered with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Bioluminescent strips provided illumination that pulsed gently, as if the ship itself was breathing. The docking bay sealed itself behind him with a sound like singing crystal, and Marcus felt the artificial gravity engage. His pod settled onto a platform that seemed to grow from the floor to accommodate its specific dimensions, adapting itself in real time to provide perfect support. The air that flooded the bay registered as breathable on his instruments, though it carried scents he couldn't identify, complex and rich like an alien forest after rain. Leave your vessel, Marcus Chen, came Drakmore's voice. no longer transmitted telepathically but resonating through the ship's structure itself. The atmosphere here will sustain you, though you may find it stimulating. Marcus cycled through his pod's airlock and stepped onto the deck of the Dragon Emperor's ship. The moment his boots touched the floor, he gasped. The air wasn't just breathable, it was alive with energy that seemed to invigorate every cell in his body. His vision sharpened, colors became more vivid, and he could feel his heart beating with newfound strength. Whatever atmospheric mixture the Draconis used, it was having a profound effect on his human physiology. The deck beneath his feet felt warm and slightly yielding, as if the ship itself was aware of his presence and adjusting to accommodate him. Pathways of light began to appear in the floor, leading deeper into the vessel's interior. Marcus followed them, his sense of wonder growing with each step. The corridors branched and merged in patterns that reminded him of neural pathways or blood vessels, creating a three-dimensional maze that somehow felt perfectly logical. Along the walls, he began to notice what appeared to be artwork, though calling them artworks seemed inadequate. The installations were dynamic, shifting between representations of stellar nurseries, complex mathematical equations, and abstract forms that hurt to look at directly but conveyed profound emotional truths. "These are memory crystals," Drakmor explained, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Each contains the experiences and knowledge of dragon emperors who came before me. Normally, only a Draconis mind can interpret them, but during the deep joining, you will gain access to their contents." Marcus paused before one crystal that was currently displaying what looked like the birth of a galaxy, countless stars condensing from primordial gas and beginning their nuclear fires. "How many emperors ruled your people?" 743, spanning approximately 50,000 Earth years. Each ruled until they chose to pass their knowledge to a successor and journey here, to the graveyard to contemplate the end of all things. I was meant to be the 744th, but there was no successor to receive the crown. I am the last, and with me ends a chain of consciousness that stretches back to the dawn of galactic civilization. The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus like a physical burden. He was about to attempt merging with not just one ancient mind, but with the accumulated wisdom of nearly 800 cosmic beings. The rational part of his brain insisted this was impossible, that human consciousness simply wasn't designed to contain such vastness. But the part of him that had always looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond the horizon whispered that some impossibilities were worth attempting. The pathway led him to the ship's heart, a vast chamber whose walls stretched up beyond his ability to see their limit. In the center of the space stood a structure that took his breath away. It was a tree, but not like any tree that had ever grown on Earth. Its trunk was formed from what appeared to be crystallized starlight, reaching impossibly high and branching into a canopy that sparkled with its own inner illumination. Beneath its roots lay a pool of liquid that reflected not the chamber around it, but depths that seemed to contain entire star systems. And coiled around the tree's base was Drakmor. The Dragon Emperor was magnificent in a way that made Marcus understand why ancient human cultures had worshipped such beings. His scales shifted between deep blue and silver, each one catching and reflecting light in patterns that suggested the movement of cosmic phenomena. He was enormous, easily 50 meters from nose to tail, but his size conveyed majesty rather than threat. His eyes, ancient beyond measure, regarded Marcus with an intelligence that seemed to encompass the breadth of the universe. "Welcome to the Chamber of Convergence," Drakmor said, his mental voice now accompanied by the resonant tones of his physical voice. Here, if anywhere, the deep joining might be possible. Marcus approached slowly, not from fear but from a reverence that seemed appropriate in such a place. "How does it work?" "The tree is grown from the heartwood of Yggdrasil Prime, the world tree that stood at the center of our first homeworld before the stars themselves were young. Its roots reach through dimensions, connecting to the fundamental forces that bind the universe together. The pool contains water from the first ocean, the primordial seas from which consciousness itself first emerged." Drakmor shifted his massive coils, revealing that parts of his body were translucent, showing internal organs that pulsed with dying light. "My life force is nearly spent, Marcus Chen. If we are to attempt this joining, it must be now, before my consciousness fragments beyond recovery." Marcus nodded, surprised by his own calm. Perhaps the alien atmosphere was affecting more than just his physical capabilities. He felt centered in a way he'd never experienced before, as if he'd finally found the place he was meant to be. "What do I need to do?" "Enter the pool," Drakmor instructed. "The water will prepare your consciousness for the joining by expanding its capacity to process nonlinear information. I will then begin the process of transferring my essence, along with the accumulated knowledge of all who came before me." Marcus began removing his environmental suit, folding each piece carefully on the crystalline shore of the impossible pool. The chamber's atmosphere felt warm against his skin, and he could sense energy patterns moving through the space around him like currents in an ocean he couldn't see. "Before we begin," Drakmor said, and for the first time his mental voice carried uncertainty, "I must tell you something that may change your willingness to proceed. The knowledge you will inherit includes not just our scientific understanding and philosophical insights, but our memories of the galaxy's dark periods, wars that consumed entire star systems, plagues that destroyed civilizations, cosmic disasters that snuffed out billions of lives. You will experience these events as if you had lived through them yourself. The pain of watching species rise and fall, of seeing hope turn to despair across millennia, of witnessing the terrible beauty and casual cruelty of an indifferent universe." Marcus paused at the pool's edge, considering this revelation. "Will I also inherit your memories of joy? Of discovery and wonder? Of connections between beings who found meaning in existence despite its temporary nature?" "Yes," Drakmor replied, and his massive head tilted in what might have been surprise. "Those as well." "Then I'm willing to accept the pain along with the wonder," Marcus said simply. "It seems to me that one gives meaning to the other." He stepped into the pool and immediately understood that calling it water had been inadequate. The liquid that rose around him was warm and slightly viscous, but more than that, it was aware. He could feel it responding to his presence, analyzing his neural patterns, preparing his consciousness for what was to come. As the level rose to his chest, then his neck, Marcus felt his perceptions beginning to expand in ways that language couldn't describe. Drakmor lowered his great head until his eyes were level with Marcus's own. "Are you ready, brave human?" "I'm ready," Marcus said, and discovered that he meant it completely. The Dragon Emperor's eyes began to glow, and Marcus felt the first tentative touch of an alien consciousness against his own. It was unlike the earlier telepathic communication, which had been like hearing a voice in a distant room. This was direct contact between minds, and the initial sensation was overwhelming. Marcus felt as if he was falling through space while simultaneously expanding to contain galaxies. But then Drakmor's presence became more gentle, more careful, and Marcus realized the ancient being was adjusting his approach to accommodate human neural architecture. The joining began slowly, with shared images, rather than complete memory transfers. Marcus saw the homeworld of the Draconis as it had been millions of years ago, a planet of crystal forests and singing mountains, where young dragons learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality through will and understanding. He experienced the first tentative steps into space, when the early dragon emperors had learned to traverse the void between stars by wrapping space around themselves like a cloak. He felt the wonder of first contact with other species, the joy of sharing knowledge and watching primitive civilizations blossom into galactic participants. But he also experienced the gradual changes that had led to the Draconis Empire's downfall, the slow shift from teachers to rulers, from partners to distant overseers, the growing arrogance that convinced them they were too advanced to learn from younger species, the retreat into isolation that had cut them off from the very diversity that had once made the galaxy vibrant and alive. "We thought ourselves beyond the need for growth," Drakmor's voice whispered through their shared consciousness. "We believed we had achieved all the understanding that was possible, but consciousness that stops growing begins dying, even if it takes millennia to notice." More memories flowed between them now, coming faster as Marcus's expanded awareness learned to process information at superhuman speeds. He experienced the terror of the plague years when a quantum virus had destroyed the DNA of entire star systems, leaving behind only empty worlds where cities stood perfectly preserved but devoid of life. He felt the desperate search for a cure that had consumed 3 generations of dragon emperors, and the hollow victory when they finally found one, only to discover that most of the species they might have saved were already extinct. He lived through the Clone Wars, when artificial intelligences had rebelled against their organic creators, and the galaxy had split into factions that fought with weapons capable of destabilizing local spacetime. He experienced the weight of making decisions that would determine which species lived and which died, choices that haunted the Dragon Emperors for millennia afterward. But the memories weren't all dark. Marcus also inherited the joy of the Great Convergence, when 17 different species had worked together to construct a ring world around their shared star, creating an artificial paradise that had lasted for 10,000 years. He felt the profound satisfaction of the healing when the Dragon Emperors had worked for centuries to repair damage done to the galactic core during an ancient war, restoring stability to star systems that had been locked in chaos for eons. Most importantly, he experienced the deep connections the dragons had formed with each other and with the universe itself. Their consciousness was fundamentally different from human awareness, operating on multiple levels simultaneously and capable of perceiving patterns that spanned galactic distances and geological time. Yet at its core was something Marcus recognized, something that resonated with his own human spirit. They loved existence. Despite all the pain, all the losses, all the terrible choices they had been forced to make, the Dragon Emperors had maintained a fundamental appreciation for the beauty and complexity of reality. They had seen wonders that would drive most minds to madness, and their response had been not fear or withdrawal, but a deeper commitment to understanding and protecting the universe they called home. As the joining deepened, Marcus felt his own consciousness expanding to accommodate not just Drakmor's memories, but the experiences of all who had come before him. 743 lifetimes of accumulated wisdom flowed into his mind, each one adding new dimensions to his understanding of existence. He experienced the universe from perspectives that spanned millions of years, saw the rise and fall of civilizations, witnessed the birth and death of stars, and somehow, impossibly, his human mind adapted to contain it all. The knowledge didn't feel foreign or overwhelming. Instead, it integrated with his existing consciousness as if it had always been there, waiting to be awakened. Marcus realized that consciousness was far more flexible than anyone had imagined, capable of growth and adaptation that transcended the apparent limitations of biology. But the process was changing him in ways that went beyond simple knowledge transfer. He could feel his perception expanding beyond human norms, his awareness beginning to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. His body was changing too, adapting to accommodate the cosmic perspective he was inheriting. When he looked down at his hands, he saw that his skin had taken on a faint luminescence, as if starlight was flowing through his veins. "Do not fear the changes," Drakmor whispered. "You are becoming something new, something that has never existed before. Neither fully human nor draconis, but a bridge between what was and what might be." Marcus nodded, though the gesture felt strange now that his consciousness was expanding beyond the confines of a single body. He could feel Drakmor's life force flowing into him, but more than that, he could feel the ancient being's profound relief at finally being able to share the burden of cosmic knowledge. The young species, Drakmor continued, his mental voice growing fainter as more of his essence transferred to Marcus. "They need guidance, but not the kind my people provided. They need teachers who remember what it was like to be curious, to be uncertain, to grow and change. You can be that teacher, Marcus Chen. You can help them avoid our mistakes while building on our discoveries." The transfer was nearly complete now, and Marcus could feel the vast library of knowledge settling into organized patterns within his expanded consciousness. But he could also feel something else, something that filled him with wonder and trepidation in equal measure. He wasn't just inheriting knowledge. He was inheriting responsibility for the galaxy's future, for guiding the younger species toward wisdom without repeating the mistakes that had doomed the Draconis Empire. It was a burden that would have crushed him only hours before, but with his expanded awareness came the strength and perspective needed to carry it. "I understand," Marcus said, though his voice now carried harmonics that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. "I'll do my best to honor what you've given me." "I have no doubt that you will succeed where we failed," Drakmor replied, and his massive form was becoming translucent as the last of his life force transferred to his unlikely successor. Remember, young teacher, wisdom is not about having all the answers. It is about knowing which questions to ask and when to listen to the questions others are asking. With a sound like the last notes of a cosmic symphony, Drakmore's physical form dissolved into points of light that swirled around the chamber before settling into the crystalline tree. The Dragon Emperor was gone, but his essence lived on, integrated now with human curiosity and determination in ways that would have been impossible to imagine mere hours before. Marcus stood alone in the pool, no longer entirely human, but not yet sure what he had become. Around him, the chamber began to change, the memory crystals in the walls pulsing with new patterns as they adapted to his transformed consciousness. He could feel the vast ship awakening around him, its systems coming online after centuries of dormancy, responding to the presence of a new master who carried the knowledge of the old. But more than knowledge, Marcus now carried understanding of his true purpose. The galaxy was full of young species struggling to find their place among the stars, making the same mistakes that had been made countless times before. They needed guidance, but not the distant, superior guidance the dragons had provided. They needed a teacher who remembered what it was like to be uncertain, to struggle, to discover wonder in the universe, one revelation at a time. Marcus Chen was ready to be that teacher. Marcus emerged from the transformative pool with movements that seemed to bend space around him. His physical form had stabilized into something that was recognizably human, but clearly more. His skin retained its luminescent quality and his eyes now held depths that suggested vast distances, but he had not lost his essential humanity. If anything, the merger with Drakmore had amplified the best qualities of his species, while adding capabilities he was only beginning to understand. The ship around him hummed with renewed life, its systems responding to his presence as they had once responded to Drakmore. But where the ancient Dragon Emperor had commanded through will and tradition, Marcus found himself working in partnership with the vessel, as if it too had been transformed by their joining. The organic curves of the corridors seemed more welcoming now, the bioluminescent strips pulsing in rhythms that reminded him of laughter. "Show me what's happening in the galaxy," Marcus said aloud. And the chamber walls immediately came alive with displays that showed him the current state of galactic civilization. The information flow was staggering, but his enhanced consciousness processed it easily. Trade routes connecting hundreds of systems, political tensions between various species councils, scientific discoveries being made at research stations scattered across the galaxy. But underneath the surface activity, Marcus could perceive deeper patterns that would have been invisible to his purely human awareness. The younger species were making the same mistakes that had doomed previous galactic civilizations. They were forming rigid hierarchies based on technological advancement, rather than wisdom. They were competing for resources instead of sharing knowledge. Most critically, they were beginning to see themselves as separate from each other, rather than as part of a larger community of conscious beings. The consortium, Marcus mused, thinking of his former employers. They're just the beginning. If this pattern continues, we'll see the rise of corporate empires that view entire species as commodities. His enhanced perception allowed him to see probability cascades stretching into the future. Possible timelines where the galaxy split into warring factions, or where a few dominant species subjugated all the others. But he could also see possibilities where the various civilizations learned to work together, pooling their unique perspectives and capabilities to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The difference between these timelines seemed to hinge on whether the younger species received proper guidance during their current period of rapid expansion. They needed someone who could show them the dangers they were approaching without trying to control their choices, someone who could teach by example rather than by decree. Marcus walked through the ship, his footsteps echoing in corridors that had been silent for centuries. In chamber after chamber, he found treasures of knowledge that the Galaxy Mining Consortium would have killed for. Advanced technologies that could revolutionize space travel. Medical techniques that could extend lifespans indefinitely. Energy sources that could power entire star systems without depleting natural resources. But Marcus now understood why Drakmore had allowed his civilization to die, rather than simply sharing these technologies with younger species. Knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, potentially catastrophic. The Draconis Empire's greatest mistake had been assuming that technological advancement automatically led to moral and philosophical development. "No," Marcus said to the empty corridors. "I won't make that mistake. If I'm going to help the younger species, I need to start by understanding what they really need, not what I think they should have." The ship's navigation systems responded to his unspoken desire, providing him with detailed information about the current state of galactic civilization. Marcus spent hours reviewing the data, using his enhanced perspective to identify species and situations where he might be able to make a positive difference. His attention was drawn to a developing crisis in the Vega system, where human colonists were locked in a territorial dispute with the native crystalline collective. The humans had established mining operations on asteroids that the collective considered sacred burial grounds. Traditional diplomatic channels had failed, and both sides were mobilizing military forces. Marcus studied the situation with growing concern. This was exactly the kind of conflict that had led to larger wars throughout galactic history. Two species, each convinced of the righteousness of their position, preparing to destroy each other over what was fundamentally a misunderstanding. "Perfect," Marcus said, though there was no humor in his voice. "My first test as a cosmic teacher, and it's already a disaster waiting to happen." But as he analyzed the situation more deeply, Marcus began to see opportunities that neither side had recognized. The humans needed the rare minerals found in the asteroid belt to complete their terraforming project on Vega 3. The crystalline collective needed to ensure that their ancestors' final resting places were treated with appropriate reverence. Neither goal was inherently incompatible with the other, but both species were approaching the problem from positions of fear and mistrust. Marcus made his decision. He would intervene, but not in the way the Dragon Emperors would have done. Instead of arriving as a superior being offering solutions, he would come as a mediator, someone who understood both perspectives and could help the two species find common ground. The journey to the Vega system gave Marcus time to experiment with his new capabilities. The ship responded to his thoughts, its ancient, faster-than-light systems operating on principles that human science was only beginning to glimpse. But more impressive was his ability to sense the broader patterns of space-time, to navigate not just through physical space but through the underlying structures that connected all points in the universe. As they traveled, Marcus found himself thinking about his former life as a mining surveyor. That Marcus Chen had been so focused on his daily routine that he'd missed the larger wonders around him. This new version of himself could perceive the intricate dance of stellar formation, the subtle interactions between gravity waves and quantum fields, the way consciousness itself seemed to be woven into the fundamental structure of reality. But he was careful not to lose touch with his human perspective, that grounding in ordinary experience, in the struggles and hopes of a brief-lived species, was what would allow him to connect with the younger civilizations in ways the dragons had never managed. The Vega system appeared on his screens as a collection of contested territories. Human ships patrolled the outer asteroid belt while crystalline vessels moved in complex geometric patterns around the disputed sites. Both fleets were heavily armed, and Marcus could see that it would take only a single miscalculation to trigger a shooting war. "Time to see if cosmic wisdom works any better than corporate mediation," Marcus murmured. He opened communication channels to both fleets simultaneously, broadcasting on frequencies that each species could understand. But instead of announcing himself as a representative of some galactic authority, he simply identified himself as Marcus Chen, independent mediator with potential solutions to their territorial dispute. The responses came back almost immediately, both sides suspicious but intrigued by his unexpected appearance. The human fleet commander, Admiral Sarah Okafor, was blunt in her assessment. "Mr. Chen, I don't know what authority you represent, but this is a human colonial matter. These asteroids contain minerals essential to our terraforming project. We have legal salvage rights granted by the Galactic Trade Authority." The crystalline collective's response was more complex, transmitted as harmonic vibrations that his enhanced consciousness translated automatically. The entity known as Resonance of Distant Stars spoke for their group. "Small, soft being who claims neutrality. The resting places of our ancestors cannot be disturbed by legal documents created by species who were not yet conscious when these sites were consecrated. The harmony of our people depends on the preservation of these sacred spaces." Marcus listened to both positions with the patience of someone who had inherited the memories of countless similar conflicts. He could see the valid concerns on both sides, but he could also see the assumptions and fears that were preventing either group from finding a solution. Admiral Okafor, Resonance of Distant Stars. Marcus broadcast to both sides. I'd like to propose a meeting, not for formal negotiations, but for education. I think both of your peoples have things to learn from each other that could benefit everyone involved. The suggestion was met with skepticism from both sides, but Marcus had anticipated that reaction. Using his enhanced understanding of psychology and diplomacy, he crafted separate messages to each group, addressing their specific concerns while gradually building interest in a peaceful resolution. To the humans, he pointed out that the crystalline collective's understanding of asteroid mineral distribution was far superior to their own surveys, and that a partnership could yield far better results than competition. To the collective, he suggested that the humans' terraforming technology might offer new ways to honor their ancestors while creating living monuments that could preserve their memory for millennia. It took 3 days of careful communication, but eventually both sides agreed to a meeting aboard Marcus's ship. He prepared the Chamber of Convergence for their arrival, though he was careful to dial down the more overwhelming aspects of its cosmic grandeur. The goal was to impress his guests with the possibility of cooperation, not to terrify them into submission. Admiral Okafor arrived first, her shuttle docking with obvious nervousness. She was a career military officer, accustomed to dealing with threats she could quantify and opponents she could understand. But as she stepped aboard Drakmor's ship, Marcus could see her engineering training kicking in, her eyes wide with appreciation for technology that was clearly beyond current human capabilities. "Mr. Cassido, Chen," she said formally, though her gaze kept wandering to the organic curves of the ship's architecture. "I have to ask, what exactly are you representing here? This vessel isn't human design, and it's certainly not registered with any authority I'm familiar with." "I represent the possibility of cooperation, Admiral," Marcus replied, guiding her through corridors that adjusted their lighting to put her at ease. "This ship belonged to someone who learned the hard way that isolation and superiority are dead ends. I'd like to help your people and the collective avoid making similar mistakes." The Crystalline Collective's representatives arrived in a vessel that seemed to be grown rather than built, its hull resembling a massive crystal formation that refracted the light of Vega's star into complex patterns. 3 entities emerged, their bodies composed of living mineral that sang softly as they moved. Marcus greeted them with harmonic frequencies that conveyed respect and welcome. Bringing the 2 groups together required all of Marcus's enhanced understanding of interspecies psychology. Humans and crystallines had fundamentally different approaches to communication, different concepts of time and space, different values regarding individual versus collective consciousness. But Marcus had inherited memories of dozens of similar first contact situations, and he knew how to find common ground between seemingly incompatible perspectives. He began with something both species could appreciate: the beauty of the Vega system itself. Using the ship's display systems, he showed them views of the star from perspectives neither group had seen before, highlighting the intricate relationships between stellar radiation, planetary atmospheres, and the mineral formations that both sides valued. The humans see these asteroids as resources that can be transformed into tools for life, Marcus explained to the crystalline representatives. For them, the highest honor they can give to matter is to use it to support consciousness and growth. The crystalline collective sees these formations as the crystallized essence of their ancestors' consciousness, preserved in mineral form for eternity. For them, the highest honor is to maintain the integrity of these structures so that future generations can commune with the wisdom of the past. Admiral Okafor frowned, clearly struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in human culture. "But they're just rocks," she said, then immediately looked embarrassed by her bluntness. Resonance of Distant Stars replied with harmonic frequencies that conveyed patient amusement. When Marcus translated, the meaning emerged as something like, "And humans are just animated carbon compounds, yet you consider your existence meaningful. Why should our ancestors' preserved consciousness be less significant than your temporary biological patterns?" The question stopped Admiral Okafor short, and Marcus could see her beginning to grasp the fundamental difference in perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way, she admitted. This was the breakthrough Marcus had been hoping for. Once both sides acknowledged that their values weren't universal truths but rather different ways of understanding reality, they could begin finding ways to honor both perspectives simultaneously. What if, Marcus suggested carefully, there was a way to extract the minerals you need without disturbing the consciousness patterns the collective values? And what if the terraforming project could include memorial structures that would allow the crystalline ancestors to remain part of a living world instead of isolated in empty space? The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes heated, but Marcus's role as mediator allowed him to guide both sides toward solutions neither had imagined. The crystallines taught the humans how to identify and preserve the consciousness-bearing crystal formations while extracting the purely mineral components. The humans shared their terraforming technology, allowing the collective to create living monuments on Vega 3 where their ancestors' wisdom could be accessed by future generations. More importantly, both species began to understand that their differences were strengths rather than obstacles. The human approach to problem-solving complemented the crystalline understanding of deep time and preservation. Together, they could achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. As the agreement took shape, Admiral Okafor pulled Marcus aside during a break in the discussions. "I have to ask," she said quietly, "how did you know all this would work? It's like you've done this before, many times." Marcus smiled, choosing his words carefully. "I've had good teachers," he said. "People who learned that cooperation usually works better than competition, that different perspectives make everyone stronger, and that the universe is too wonderful to waste on fighting over who gets to control which pieces of it." The final ceremony took place in the asteroid belt, with ships from both fleets arranged in a formation that honored both human and crystalline aesthetic principles. As Marcus watched the two species work together to implement their agreement, he felt a satisfaction that was both personal and cosmic. This was what the Dragon Emperors had forgotten how to do: guide without controlling, teach without dictating, help species find their own paths to wisdom. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The galaxy was full of similar conflicts, similar opportunities to help young civilizations learn from each other. His enhanced perspective showed him probability cascades, where this successful cooperation spread to other systems, inspiring new forms of interspecies partnership. The future was far from certain, but for the first time in millennia, it was trending toward hope rather than tragedy. 6 months after the Vega Accords, as historians would later call the agreement between humanity and the Crystalline Collective, Marcus found himself standing in the council chamber of the Galactic Assembly for the first time in his transformed existence. The massive amphitheater was filled with representatives from over 300 species, all gathered to address what many were calling the most significant shift in galactic politics since the formation of the Trade Authority itself. News of the Vega success had spread throughout inhabited space, faster than Marcus had anticipated. The cooperation between humans and crystallines had produced results that neither species could have achieved alone. The terraforming of Vega 3 was proceeding ahead of schedule, creating not just a new human colony, but a unique hybrid ecosystem where crystalline consciousness preserves grew alongside traditional biological life. More importantly, the success had inspired similar partnerships across dozens of other systems, but success on such a scale inevitably drew attention from those who profited from the old ways of doing things. The Galactic Mining Consortium had put a price on Marcus's head, claiming he was interfering with legitimate commercial operations. Several major corporations were lobbying for military action against what they termed unregulated mediation activities. Most concerning of all, the hegemony of dominant species was demanding his appearance before the Assembly to answer charges of violating the Cosmic Development Accords. Marcus had debated whether to respond to the summons at all. His enhanced capabilities meant he could simply disappear into the galaxy's unexplored regions, continuing his work from the shadows. But Drakmor's memories reminded him that avoiding responsibility had been one of the Dragon Empire's fatal mistakes. Sometimes, standing up to authority was the only way to create real change. The council chamber itself was a marvel of architecture, designed to accommodate the wildly different physiological needs of galactic species. Atmospheric zones shifted seamlessly from one section to another. Gravity fields adjusted to accommodate beings who had evolved under different stellar conditions, and translation systems ensured that every word was understood regardless of the speaker's method of communication. At the center of it all stood the arbitration podium, where Marcus now waited for the proceedings to begin. He had chosen to appear in his transformed but still recognizably human form, wanting the assembly to understand that he represented evolution rather than replacement, cooperation rather than conquest. The first to speak was Chancellor Vexmari of the Hegemony, her chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's lights as she addressed the assembly with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Honored delegates, her translated voice rang through the chamber. We are here to address a dangerous precedent. This individual, Marcus Chen, has been operating throughout our territories without authorization, interfering with established commercial and territorial agreements. His actions threaten the stability of our carefully balanced economic and political systems. Murmurs rose from various sections of the assembly, some supportive of the chancellor's position, others clearly skeptical. Marcus listened with the patience of someone who had inherited millennia of experience with political theater, waiting for his moment to respond. Furthermore, Chancellor Vexmari continued, intelligence reports suggest that Chen has somehow gained access to forbidden technologies, possibly of Draconis origin. The dragons retreated from galactic affairs for good reason. Their interference in the natural development of younger species led to stagnation and conflict. We cannot allow history to repeat itself. This accusation drew more reaction from the assembly. The Draconis Empire's final years had indeed been marked by increasingly heavy-handed attempts to guide galactic civilization, creating resentment that persisted even now, thousands of years after their withdrawal. The suggestion that Marcus might represent a return to those policies was calculated to turn the assembly against him. When the Chancellor finished her presentation, the arbitrator, an ancient cerebral collective entity whose consciousness spanned multiple bodies, gestured for Marcus to respond. The chamber fell silent, hundreds of alien eyes focusing on the transformed human who had managed to change the course of galactic politics from the pilot seat of a mining survey pod. Honored delegates, Marcus began, his voice carrying harmonics that reached every being in the chamber regardless of their auditory range. Chancellor Vexmari is correct about one thing. I have indeed gained access to Draconis knowledge, and I understand why that concerns many of you, but I'm not here as their representative, and I'm certainly not here to impose their will on anyone. He paused, letting his enhanced perception read the emotional currents flowing through the assembly. Fear, curiosity, hope, and suspicion all swirled together in complex patterns that told him exactly how to proceed. I'm here because I've seen what happens when species work together instead of simply competing for dominance. The Vega Accords didn't succeed because I forced anyone to do anything. They succeeded because humans and crystallines discovered they could achieve their goals better through cooperation than through conflict. Marcus gestured, and the chamber's display systems came alive with images from Vega 3. The hybrid ecosystem was thriving beyond anyone's projections, the crystalline consciousness preserves actually enhancing the planet's ability to support biological life, while the terraforming technology had created new forms of mineral growth that the collective found sacred. The old model of galactic civilization assumes that resources are limited and that one species' success must come at another's expense, Marcus continued. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the universe is abundant enough to support everyone's dreams, if we're smart enough to work together instead of fighting over scraps? Representative Kythek of the Andromedan Confederacy rose to speak, his four arms gesturing in patterns that conveyed deep skepticism. These are pretty words, Chen, but you speak as if cooperation is simple. Different species have incompatible goals, contradictory values, fundamentally different ways of understanding reality. The trade authority exists precisely because we need neutral frameworks to manage these differences. You're absolutely right, Marcus replied, surprising many in the chamber with his immediate agreement. Cooperation isn't simple, and it isn't always possible. But it's more possible than we usually assume, and the benefits when it works are greater than most of us can imagine. He gestured again, and the displays shifted to show data from the 17 other systems where Vega-inspired partnerships had developed over the past 6 months. Worlds where Vorthak merchants and human engineers had developed new forms of interstellar commerce. research stations where multiple species pooled their unique capabilities to solve problems none could have tackled alone, defense agreements based on mutual support rather than balance of power politics. The pattern is consistent, Marcus explained. When species focus on understanding each other's actual needs rather than just protecting their own interests, they usually discover that their goals are compatible. Not identical, but compatible. Chancellor Vexmari's exoskeleton rattled in what Marcus recognized as barely controlled anger. And when they're not compatible? When fundamental interests truly conflict? Your idealism is touching, Chen. But the galaxy is full of species that would gladly consume their neighbors if they thought they could get away with it. You're thinking of the Devourers, Marcus said quietly, and the chamber fell silent at the mention of the galaxy's most feared predatory species. They've been expanding through the outer rim for decades, consuming everything in their path. Traditional deterrence hasn't stopped them because they don't negotiate and they don't fear retaliation. But they do have vulnerabilities if we're willing to work together to exploit them. This was Marcus's gamble, the moment that would determine whether the Assembly saw him as a threat to be contained or an ally to be supported. He had spent weeks analyzing the Devourer expansion patterns, using his enhanced perspective to identify weaknesses that no single species could exploit alone. The Devourers rely on psychological warfare as much as military force, he explained as new displays showed their expansion patterns. They target systems where the inhabitants are isolated, where local defenses have no hope of support from neighbors. But their technology has a critical flaw. It's designed for overwhelming individual opponents, not for facing coordinated multi-species resistance. Marcus outlined a defense strategy that would have been impossible under the old competitive model of galactic politics. Human mobility, crystalline long-range sensing, Andromedan manufacturing capacity, Vorthak logistical networks, and dozens of other species' unique capabilities, all coordinated into a defensive alliance that could actually stop the Devourer advance. But this only works if we stop seeing cooperation as a sign of weakness, Marcus concluded. The Devourers succeed because they exploit our assumption that asking for help makes us vulnerable. What if we turned that assumption on its head? What if species that requested assistance were seen as strong enough to admit they can't do everything alone? The debate that followed stretched for hours, with representatives from across the galaxy weighing the implications of Marcus's proposal. Some dismissed it as naive idealism, while others saw it as a practical solution to problems that traditional politics had failed to address. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge. Not everyone trusted Marcus, and not everyone believed his approach would work. But the Devourer threat was real and growing, and traditional methods had proven inadequate to contain it. The Vega success and its aftermath had demonstrated that cooperation could produce results that competition couldn't match. Perhaps it was worth trying a new approach. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Marcus had hoped but still decisive. The Assembly authorized the formation of a mutual defense and development alliance, with Marcus serving as its first coordinator. It wasn't the transformative mandate he might have wished for, but it was a beginning. As delegates filed out of the chamber, many stopping to speak with Marcus about implementation details and timeline concerns, he found himself thinking about the mining surveyor he had been just months before. That Marcus Chen had been focused on getting through each day with as little trouble as possible, never imagining that his life could have consequences beyond his own small corner of existence. This Marcus Chen carried the weight of galactic civilization's future on his shoulders, but somehow the burden felt lighter than his old routine had. Purpose, he reflected, made even cosmic responsibility seem manageable. An interesting beginning, came a familiar mental voice, though this time it seemed to originate from within his own consciousness rather than from an external source. Drakmor? Marcus thought back. I am part of you now, as you are part of me. The line between teacher and student, between human and dragon, has blurred beyond recognition. But that is as it should be. Growth requires the dissolution of old categories and the creation of new possibilities. Marcus smiled, drawing curious looks from the few delegates still in the chamber. Any advice for what comes next? Remember that change is not a destination, but a process. The galaxy will not transform overnight. And there will be setbacks, failures, moments when the old ways seem easier than the new ones you're trying to build. But every small success creates the foundation for larger ones. Every species that learns to cooperate makes it easier for others to follow their example. Over the following months, as Marcus worked to implement the MDDA framework, he discovered the truth of Drakmore's words. Change came slowly, often in frustrating increments that seemed insignificant against the scale of galactic civilization. But it did come. The Crystalline Collective shared their deep-time perspective with human strategic planners, revolutionizing long-term thinking about resource management and ecological development. Human adaptability and engineering creativity helped the Andromedans develop new forms of manufacturing that were both more efficient and more environmentally sustainable. Vorthak trading networks became the backbone of an information sharing system that allowed rapid response to devourer incursions. Each success built momentum for the next one, creating a cascade of positive changes that began to reshape how species throughout the galaxy thought about their relationships with each other. The competitive model didn't disappear entirely, but it was increasingly balanced by cooperative alternatives that often proved more effective. The real test came when the Devourers finally encountered the new alliance in force. Their attack on the Centauri system was massive, designed to overwhelm local defenses and create the kind of psychological shock that usually led to rapid expansion into neighboring territories. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated response from 18 different species, each contributing their unique capabilities to a defense that adapted in real time to counter every Devourer tactic. Human ships provided mobility and flexibility. Crystalline installations offered unbreachable defensive positions. Andromedan manufacturing capacity replaced losses faster than the attackers could inflict them. More importantly, the Alliance demonstrated something the Devourers had never encountered: a defense that got stronger under pressure instead of fragmenting. Every attack was met with innovations developed by multiple species working together, creating solutions that no single civilization could have imagined. The Battle of Centauri lasted 3 standard months, but its outcome was never really in doubt once the Alliance forces reached full coordination. The Devourers retreated beyond the Outer Rim, and for the first time in decades, their expansion had been not just halted, but reversed. Standing in the rebuilt council chamber a year after the Centauri victory, Marcus watched delegates from over 400 species debate the formation of a permanent galactic cooperation treaty. The discussions were heated, often chaotic, but they were taking place at all was a victory he could barely have imagined when he'd been a mining surveyor. Worried about meeting his daily quotas, "The universe is vast and full of wonders," he said to the assembly during the treaty's final ratification ceremony. "But the greatest wonder of all is consciousness itself, the ability of matter to wake up and understand its own existence. Every species in this chamber represents a unique way of experiencing reality, a perspective that adds to the universe's understanding of itself." He paused, looking out over the sea of alien faces, remembering a dying dragon emperor who had despaired that his people's knowledge would die with him. "We are not competitors for the universe's attention," Marcus continued. "We are partners in the cosmic project of understanding and growth, and together there is no limit to what we can discover, what we can become, what wonders we can create among the stars." The treaty passed by the largest margin in assembly history, establishing frameworks for cooperation that would guide galactic civilization for millennia to come. But Marcus knew this was not an ending but another beginning. The universe was vast, filled with species not yet contacted, challenges not yet imagined, wonders not yet discovered. Somewhere in the outer spiral arms, new civilizations were taking their first steps into space. In time, they would need guidance not from distant superiority, but from partners who remembered what it was like to be young and uncertain, and full of questions about their place among the stars. Marcus Chen, former mining surveyor, cosmic mediator, bridge between what was and what could be, smiled and began planning his next impossible mission. The galaxy was a big place, full of opportunities for species to discover that they were stronger together than apart, and he had all the time in the universe to help them figure it out.